السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وتعاونوا على البر والتقوى ولا تعاونوا على الإثم والعدوان واتقوا الله إن الله شديد العقاب. صدق الله العلي العظيم. In the field of historic research, in order for the research to hold any intellectual weight, it must be free of bias. It must be conducted professionally. And when researching a certain identity, a certain issue, a certain topic, the person presenting the research, the researcher or the historian, must not neglect one important concept, and that is the concept of context. When we speak about context, we are speaking of the circumstances which revolve around a certain issue. In order to completely understand an issue, we must understand the circumstances that it is placed in, or the circumstances that it was created in historically. For instance, when it comes to the Quran, we know, according to the Quran itself, that the entire Quran was revealed in one night upon our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إنا أنزلناه في ليلة القدر. Indeed, we, God speaking of himself, have sent down the Quran في ليلة القدر, in the night of Qadr, which is in Ramadan, the entire Quran. And then Quranic commentators say that for a period of 23 years, the verses of the Quran were sent down again upon the Prophet. And one reason this happened was because many of these verses were relevant to a certain context. And they were revealed at a certain time and a certain age. For instance, the verses which speak about the Muslims defending themselves against the enemies, these were revealed in a certain context. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks of Al-Ahzab, the battle of the trench, when the non-believers, they surrounded the city of Medina in order to attack the Muslims. Now, one of the things that the Prophet did when he entered Medina was he established a constitution, referred to as Sahifatul Medina, the Constitution of Medina. And this constitution is available. Some historical sources, they narrate the details of this constitution. One of the clauses of this constitution was that the inhabitants of the city of Medina would work together and they would not fight against each other. That they would live, they would coexist in peace. Each person had freedom to practice their own religion, whether they were Muslim or Christian or Jewish or what have you. People practiced their own cultures, and everybody was respected. One of the clauses mentioned that none of the inhabitants shall engage in treason against the citizens, their countrymen, or against the country. So what happened during the Battle of Al-Ahzab is that some of the Jewish tribes which were inside Medina, who were under this constitution, they turned against their Muslim brethren and they supported the enemy. So in one of the verses in Surah Al-Ahzab, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the Prophet and the Muslims to engage in battle with that certain tribe which turned against them. So this was one verse, or one set of verses, which was narrated under a certain context. And in order to understand the influence of these verses, or the effect of these verses, one must understand the context. We must understand the history of when these verses were revealed. What happens when we misunderstand is we take verses out of context. And this is what happens today. This is what Muslim extremists are guilty of today, taking verses out of context. And this is what anti-Islamists are also guilty of today, taking these verses out of context. They have not understood the context behind these verses, so they begin to misinterpret it. So historically speaking, one must understand context, the issues or the circumstances which revolve around a certain event or a certain issue, in order for this research to have any intellectual weight. Recently, I was reading a book written by a non-Muslim, an Orientalist, about the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And what she mentioned was something interesting. She sought to answer the question of why was the Prophet at a young age, in his infancy, given to a wet nurse, Halima Sa'diyah. The Prophet, our Prophet, his father died when his mother was pregnant with him, and his mother also died at a young age. He was given by his family to a wet nurse, a woman who would breastfeed him. She sought to answer the question, why was he given in particular to Halima Sa'diyah? Because Halima Sa'diyah was not from a noble family, she was not wealthy. In fact, she was a Bedouin woman who did not live inside of Mecca. She lived outside of Mecca. And even when she came, she did not have enough milk to breastfeed her own child. So why did they agree to give this young man, orphan, into the care of this woman? She states this, that because Halima Sa'diyah lived outside of Mecca, because she was a Bedouin, she had certain attributes. At that time, the Arabs sought certain attributes, like bravery and courage. Why? Because in order for a person to survive, he needed to be brave and courageous. And this was a part of nobility, to be brave and courageous. She says that the Bedouins who were living outside of Mecca were known for their bravery and their courage. Why? Because naturally, when you're living in the desert, you have to protect yourself against thieves, against wild animals, against enemies. So these Bedouins, they had these qualities, such as bravery. And this is why it was important to place this young infant or toddler under her care so that he can learn bravery and courage from the Bedouin Arabs. So see, it's important to understand the context. It's important to understand geography. It's important to understand psychology in order to seek these answers. That's why, brothers and sisters, when it comes to the biography of the Prophet and the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, it is very important that we do not neglect the issue of context, especially historical context. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Our fifth Imam of the school of Ahlul Bayt, Al-Imam Muhammad Al-Baqir, salawatullah wa salamu alayhi, when historians mention his upbringing, after mentioning his birth in the holy city of Medina, the city of his grandfather, they mention one of the first events that took place in his life. And in order to understand the attitude, the behavior, the sayings, and the actions of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, we must understand the historical context. We must understand the politics that took place. We must understand the geography. We must understand all of these issues in order to be able to interpret their behaviors accordingly and live according to their behaviors and according to their sayings and actions. Al-Imam Muhammad Al-Baqir alayhi salam, his title was Al-Baqir. And in the Arabic language, Al-Baqir means, the literal meaning is what? the one who splits through, or the one who breaks through. And the reason why he was given this title, the fifth Imam, is because of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, after, of course, the time of the Prophet and Imam Ali alayhi salam, he was the first to reintroduce the teachings and the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt in the society. So this knowledge and these sciences which remained dormant during the time of Al-Imam al-Hasan, during the time of Al-Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, during the time of Imam Zayn al-Abidin, these sciences which were prohibited from being circulated during the time of Al-Imam Al-Baqir alayhi salam, they became what? They became introduced into society. So he broke through the knowledge of Rasulullah and Ahlul Bayt, which stayed dormant for such a long time. And he was known for this attribute. He would spread knowledge among his family members and among his companions, and he had many, many students. There are some people, some of his students narrated hundreds of ahadith from him, some of them thousands of ahadith from this man. And in order to understand his attitude, we must understand, first of all, his life. After mentioning his birth, the historians mention the first significant event which took place in his life, and that was that he witnessed the tragedy of Karbala. According to historians, and by his own account, he says that on the day of Ashura, the Imam says, according to his hadith, he says, I was 4 years old. So he witnessed the tragedy of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. His education, which he passed on to other people, began with his grandfather. The hadith says that he used to sit in the lap of his grandfather, Imam Hussein alayhi salam, and he used to teach him when he was an infant and when he was a toddler. In order to understand his attitude, we must understand the historical context. The Imam, as well as all of the other Imams, they had the spirit of revolt in them. They had the spirit of resistance in them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَتَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْبِرِّ وَالتَّقْوَى وَلَا تَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْإِثْمِ وَالْعُدْوَانِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders us, He commands us to cooperate in producing good for ourselves and for our societies. And He says, وَلَا تَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْإِثْمِ وَالْعُدْوَانِ. Do not cooperate in the perpetration of sinful acts. Fight injustice. In another verse He says, وَلَا تَرْكَنُوا إِلَى الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا فَتَمَسَّكُمُ النَّارِ. Do not incline to those who create dhulm, injustice, lest you shall be punished in the hellfire. And there are many ahadith which tell us that those who cooperate in sinful acts are held just as responsible as the main perpetrators of those sinful acts. This spirit of fighting injustice existed within the Prophet and the Imams of Ahlul Bayt. And this is one of the things which we pride ourselves as Muslims and as followers of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, is the spirit of revolt, the spirit of resistance, the spirit of revolution that we have in us. And when I speak of resistance and revolt and revolution and fighting injustice, this doesn't necessarily mean you go out with a sword or you go out with a weapon and you fight an oppressive government. When we speak of injustice, there are many forms of injustice. There is political injustice, when you have a tyrant and a dictator and an oppressed people. There is social injustice, when people steal from each other, and this is what the Quran says, ظَهَرَ الْفَسَادُ فِي الْبَرِّ وَالْبَحْرِ بِمَا كَسَبَتْ أَيْدِي النَّاسِ. That corruption is a consequence of the injustices of people stealing from each other. This is the apparent form of injustice. And then there is a hidden form of injustice. And that's the injustice which takes place inside every human being. It's when your soul tells you, commands you, and insists that you do evil. إِنَّ النَّفْسَ لَأَمَّارَةٌ بِالسُّوءِ. The soul, its nature is to insist on evil. So when we're speaking about rebellion, when we are speaking about resistance, we are not only speaking about outside resistance, we are speaking about our attitude to resist the evil which is inside ourselves as well. And this This was the bedrock of the teachings of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. And it began with the Prophet fighting injustices. And this is why he was not tolerated in his community. Justice, equality, equal rights, equal opportunity, equal wealth. The Quraysh did not want any of this. The Quraysh wanted an aristocracy where they controlled the market, they controlled the influence, they had everything. So when the Prophet came and he implemented economic measures, for instance, he told them that in the market, in the bazaar, nobody is allowed to build a building. Why? Because when you build a building, what happens? Somebody owns this building, he's going to extort the people that work for him, he's going to take rent, and he's going to take taxes. And a person who has no capital, well, what is he going to do if he can't afford rent? He's not going to be able to sell his product. This is why the bazaar, and until today when you go to traditional bazaars, you see that the way it is set up is that it is set up with tents. Why? Because these can be erected and they can be taken down. Whoever would go and erect his tent or his store, he had the opportunity to sell. But Quraysh were not accepting this. When it came time to Imam Ali alayhi salam, because again, when we speak of resistance and revolt in the context of Ahlul Bayt, the first person we think of is Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Why? Because he fought with the sword against the tyrant. But the Imams before him, they also had the spirit of resistance, but they dealt with it in appropriate ways. I'll give you an example. When you study the attitude and the life of Imam Ali, Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Many people, even the followers of Ahlul Bayt, they have a misconception. They say that the Imam, it's true that injustices took place after the life of the death of the Prophet, that the Khilafah was taken from him, and this happened to his family, and this happened to his wife, and he was ostracized by the community. But he remained quiet. He did not resist oppression. He did not resist injustice. This is not true. The Imam did resist oppression, and he did resist injustice, but he did it in the wisest of ways. First of all, to answer the question of why didn't Imam demand his rights for Khilafah, number one, he was following the orders of Rasulullah. It is said that before Rasulullah passed away, he looked to Imam Ali. He said, Ya Ali, you are like the Kaaba. The Kaaba, when we want to visit it, we go and visit it. It does not come to us. No matter where we are in the world, we have to go to perform the Hajj. We have to go to the Kaaba. The Kaaba does not come to us. He's told him, you are like the Kaaba. If people come to you, then accept their allegiance. But if people do not come to you, do not go to them. Do not demand that they come to you. So first of all, he was following the orders of Rasulullah. Second of all, after the Prophet died, and after the people gathered and decided between themselves who would be the Khalifa, Abu Sufyan came to Imam Ali. He first went to Al-Abbas, the uncle of Imam Ali. He says, Ya Abbas, I want to go to Ali, I want to speak to him about something, a private matter. So he goes with him. He tells him, Ya Ali, this is Abu Sufyan saying, the staunch enemy of Islam. He's saying, Ya Ali, don't mind what these people are doing. Don't mind that they have picked a successor among themselves. Extend your hand. Let me pledge allegiance to you, and upon your request, I will fill Medina with infantry. I have my infantry, my army, my soldiers waiting in Mecca, the soldiers of Quraysh. I will fill it, and we will do a military coup, a military takeover. Imam Ali alayhi salam, the opportunity presented itself to him, but he knew that Abu Sufyan had a different agenda in mind in the future, because he wanted control for himself. That he would perform treachery and mutiny, and one day he would turn against Imam Ali and his family. So Imam Ali alayhi salam did not sit and stay quiet. First of all, he was following the commands of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and when he was requested, when he was needed for his input, he provided his input. Many times, many times, it happened where people came to the masjid, to the khalifas of the time, the illegitimate khalifas, and they requested that they judge between them in certain affairs. Many of the times the Khalifa himself did not know how to answer. Who would they call upon? Imam Ali alayhi salam. This is why one of them, he made a dua one day. And this dua is narrated. He said that, may Allah not find me in a situation where Abu al-Hasan is not there, Imam Ali alayhi salam. This shows that how much they were in need. Imam Ali did not ostracize himself from the political arena. Look at his companions. Imam Ali had some of the greatest companions. People like Salman al-Muhammadi. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Salman, although he was one of the closest, arguably the closest companion to Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, but during the time of Imam Ali, the Imam had commanded him to accept a position of leadership in the illegitimate government. He told him, go. And they offered him a leadership to be a governor of a city, and the Imam told him, accept it. At the same time, the Imam had other companions like Abu Dhar al-Ghifari. And the job of Abu Dhar al-Ghifari was to stand and openly, publicly criticize the government of Uthman and Muawiyah. So the Imam was involved in the political arena, and he resisted the oppression, but he did it in a very appropriate manner. So the spirit of revolution, the spirit of resistance was strong in Amir al-Mu'mineen. Even when it came to his own khilafah, there were people in his army whom he spoke out against. And he resisted their injustices. He revolted against their oppression. When it comes time to studying the life of Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam, we find that he also revolted against oppression, but in his own way. Although the Imam agreed to a ceasefire and a peace treaty with Muawiyah, but that does not mean that he remained silent. No. Whenever the Imam was needed, again, like his father, he also provided his input. Not until it came time to Imam Hussein alayhi salam. And even when Imam Hussein became the Imam, he did not revolt against the government right away. He lived under Muawiyah for 10 years. And the reason he did this is because he respected the contract which his older brother Al-Imam al-Hasan had created. Once Muawiyah broke the contract and he placed his son Yazid as the illegitimate Khalifa, this is when Imam Hussein alayhi salam saw incumbent upon himself to fight with the sword. And this is where this spirit of resistance, of revolution was manifested through the actions of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. See, all of this comes from the Quran. All of this comes from this verse. وَلَا تَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْإِثْمِ وَالْعُدْوَانِ. Do not cooperate in the perpetration of sinful acts. The Imam never cooperated in the perpetration of sinful acts. They say that, in other schools of thought, that Imam Ali was happy. He was happy with the battles which were being fought by the illegitimate governments. Why? Because he sent his sons, Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein, to the front of the battlefield in order to fight the illegitimate wars which were fought by the Khulafa which came after Rasulullah. But when it comes down to it, Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein alayhi salam, they were 7 and 8 years old at that time. And the Imam would place them in the front of the battlefield. It doesn't make sense. So the spirit of resistance existed within the Prophet and the Imams of Ahlul Bayt. They manifested this verse, وَلَا تَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْإِثْمِ وَالْعُدْوَانِ. Do not cooperate in the perpetration of sinful acts. When it came time to Imam Zayn al-Abidin salawatullah wa salamu alayhi, one of the things which he witnessed was also the tragedy of Ashura. But what is particular about the 4th Imam and the 5th Imam is the way that they channeled their tragedies. Imam Zayn al-Abidin salawatullah wa salamu alayhi, arguably the battle of Ashura had a profound effect on his life. But how did he channel his tragedies? Did he fight against the government with the sword? He didn't fight against the government with the sword. Did he speak out publicly against the government? No. How did he channel his tragedies? Through spirituality. This is the way that he dealt with oppression. Dealing with oppression, brothers and sisters, when we say, when we speak about fighting against injustices and fighting about oppression, I repeat, I say this, we're not talking about holding a weapon or holding a sword or organizing demonstrations and creating anarchy. Sometimes resisting injustice, rebelling against oppression is something completely different. In the viewpoint or in the attitude of the fourth Imam, Al-Imam Zayn al-Abidin alayhi salam, he fought oppression by doing what? By channeling his tragedy into spirituality. And there's something very important about this. The ahadith would say that he spent nights, weeks, months, every single night he would prostrate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So much so that he earned the nickname Zaynul Abidin, the adornment, the beauty of the believers. Another one of his titles is Sayyidus Sajidin, the master of those who prostrate. He would prostrate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for such prolonged periods of time. And he would weep out of the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for such a long time. It is said that the dirt which was under his forehead would turn into mud because of his tears, because of how his tears would drench the ground which was under him. Why did he create this spirituality? This was his way of dealing with oppression. This was his way of resisting injustice. He channeled it through spirituality. Why? Because the Imam recognized that if a person develops a strong relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is enough to deal with injustices and with oppression. Why? Because if you have a strong relationship with Allah, you are not going to envy people, you are not going to want to hurt people, you are not going to want to steal from people. And this is the philosophy of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt. One of the companions of the seventh Imam, Hisham ibn al-Hakam, when he speaks about infallibility and when he attributes it to the Imams, he says that infallibility is an ability to refrain from sin. And he goes on to explain, what does it mean to refrain from sin? He says that sin is caused by a number of things. One is hatred. One is envy. And he lists a number of things. He says none of these evil attributes, which are the causes of sin, none of these existed within the prophets and the Imams. Envy, were they ever envious of anyone? There were people who had more money than them, more materials, but the Imams did not look after materials. They didn't care about materials. When it came to spiritual wealth, moral wealth, was there anyone who was wealthier than the Imams of Ahlul Bayt? Was there someone who was more noble than the Imams of Ahlul Bayt? No. So there was nobody higher than them. That's why they were never jealous about anyone. They were never angry at anyone. That's why they never stole or they never hit anybody. They never struck anybody. And this is what it comes down to, infallibility. Is that the cause for sin did not exist within themselves. And this is why Al-Imam Zayn al-Abidin had such a pure attitude. He fought against oppression and he fought against his own self. Every single person has a nafs which is insistent on evil. Inna an-nafsa la'ammaratun bis-su'. Yes? It's not like the Imams never had desire or never had temptations. No. But they knew the consequences and they were able to resist that. That's why, look at the consequence of the spirituality of Imam Zayn al-Abidin. Look at how he was able to fight oppression and injustice. The injustice of people and the injustice of himself. It is said that one day, he was praying in Al-Masjid al-Haram. After he was done with his prayers, he left. He was going back home. So a man came to him. He greeted him. The Imam greeted back. He said, "Are you the one that they call Zaynul Abidin? Are you the one that they call the beauty of the believers, the adornment of the believers?" He says, yes. He says, "La, bal anta shaynul abidin." Shayn is the exact opposite of Zayn, meaning evil or ugly. He says, "You are the ugly one." And then he begins to curse the Imam. Imagine, the Imam is standing and he has his companion, and this man is cursing and he continues to curse. After he stops, what does the Imam say to him? Now when a person curses at you, sometimes you have no control. It's an instinct to curse back at that person, to strike that person. That is a direct result of your nafs, your evil side telling you, He did evil to you, you do evil to him as well. Whereas this is not the philosophy of the Quran. ادفع بالتي هي أحسن فإذا الذي بينك وبينه عداوة كأنه ولي حميم. The Quran says repel evil with good. If you repel evil with good, if someone does evil to you and you do good to him in return, فإذا الذي بينك وبينه عداوة كأنه ولي حميم. This person will transform from an enemy, from a nemesis to your best friend. Why? Just because of a simple act, repelling evil with good. So this person, he curses at the Imam until he stops. Now, the Imam, if he did not have the spirit of rebellion, if he did not have the spirit to resist injustice, what would he have done? He would have cursed him back, right? He would have cursed him. He would have invoked Allah. Maybe not use profanity, but he can invoke Allah's curse on this person. He could say, may Allah not have mercy on you, for instance. It's not something evil. What did the Imam reply to him? He told him, Ya hada, every evil attribute that you attributed to me, I have. Every bad thing that you said about me is true. And what you don't know about me is even worse. This is the way he repelled him. Then the Imam continued. He said, thank you for your admonishment. Thank you for remembering my evil side. Is there something that I can do for you in return? Now that you have provided this admonishment, is there a service that I can provide for you in return? At this moment, the man began to weep. And he said, Ashhadu annaka ibnu Rasulillah. He says, I bear witness that you are the son of Rasulullah. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So this man begins to apologize from the Imam. He's weeping, he is apologizing. He said, Ya ibn Rasulullah, I apologize. I am so embarrassed. I do not have any hard feelings towards you. But there were some people who were bribing me. And I was in need of the money. They said that if you want money from us, go and curse Zainul Abidin. Go and make him become angry. See, they could not understand how calm he was. They could not stand how calm he was. They could not stand his morality, his akhlaq. They wanted him to display some sort of evil. Why? Because if he were to display evil only once, they know that the people would abandon him. But people kept flocking towards the Imams of Ahlul Bayt. Why? Through their akhlaq, through their morality. He told him, there were people who told me that if I can manage to get you angry, they will give me this much money. He looked at him. He said that if you needed this much money, why didn't you come to me in the first place? I would have given you the money without having to have you curse anybody. He turned to his companions and says, give him the money that he wants. This was the morality of Rasulullah. This was the morality of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. This is the way that they were able to repel evil with good. And what is the source of this? The source of this is the spirituality of Imam Zainul Abidin. And this is how he was able to resist oppression and resist tyranny, not with the sword, not with the weapon, but merely by establishing a relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is what he was able to achieve. And Imam Hussein alayhi salam, it is said that one day he was in Medina, and for 10 years he lived during the time of Muawiyah. Now, if you read about Muawiyah was different than other khulafa. Because one thing that Muawiyah did, he was conniving, he was a con artist, he was very smart. He knew how to deceive people. And since he was far away, since he was in Damascus, he had, a fresh group of people, fresh minds which he could poison. So what did he do? The same way that today when a government wants to go into war, what do? They make a case, right? And they begin to spread. The government cannot pay our bills, but they wanted to approve $2.7 billion or trillion for the next 15 years for war. They wanted to go to war with Syria, but they don't have enough money to pay our bills. So you can't enjoy the national parks. See, the same way the government builds propaganda in order to reach a certain goal, and that is war or whatever it is, Muawiyah did the same thing. Muawiyah did the exact same thing in order to create animosity and hatred for Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. He would pay people to narrate hadith saying that Ali ibn Abi Talib doesn't even pray. He doesn't pray. And people in Sham and Damascus, they grew up believing that Imam Ali does not pray. One of the enemy during the battle of Siffin between the forces of Imam Ali and Muawiyah, he comes to the battleground, he comes to the camp of Imam Ali, and he begins to curse the companions, and he begins to curse Imam Ali. He begins to curse him. He says, why does he not pray? May Allah curse him for not praying. So one of the companions, he says, come here, come here. He takes him by the hand, he takes him to the camp of Amir al-Mu'mineen. He takes him to the tent of the companions. He says, do you see this companion? Malik al-Ashtar, for instance. He says, do you see the way he's praying? He tells him, yes, I see the way he prays. He takes him to another companion. Do you see the way Al-Miqdad is praying? Do you see the way Ammar ibn Yasir is praying? He says, if these people are praying day and night, how do you expect their commander not to pray? So there was propaganda which was being used against Ahlul Bayt. So one day a man comes to Medina during the time of Muawiyah, during the time of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. His sole intention was to meet the Imam so he can curse him. People would travel hundreds of kilometers, hundreds of miles to come and curse the Imams of Ahlul Bayt. So he comes to him. He narrates the story. He says, I came seeking Al-Hussein bin Ali. I found him. I began to curse him. He says, I cursed him. I cursed until I ran out of breath. Until he stopped. He said that there was nobody which I hated more than Hussein and his family. I could not stand them. So what did the Imam do? The Imam did not curse him back. The Imam began to recite verses of the Quran. This is how they replied. They replied using the logic of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. خُذِ الْعَفْوَ وَأْمُرْ بِالْعُرْفِ وَأَعْرِضْ عَنِ الْجَاهِلِينَ. The Quran commands the Prophet to be all forgiving. And if people, juhala, if people who are ignorant come to you, turn away from them. And then the Imam tells him that you seem to be a traveler. You seem to be strange in this land. He says, yes, I'm a traveler. He says, do you have a place to stay? If you do not, you can stay in my home. Do you have food to eat? If you do not, I can prepare a meal for you. This man says that at that moment, I wish that the earth would open up and swallow me whole because of how embarrassed I was. And the Imam told him, don't worry. You haven't done anything evil. This is only propaganda that you have fed, that you have been fed. So this is the way that the Imams were able to repel evil with good. So Imam Zayn al-Abidin, one thing which he established with spirituality, this is the way that he fought against oppression. This is the way that he rebelled against injustice. And that's why when it comes to the life of Imam Al-Baqir, salawatullah wa salamu alayhi, he was known also for his spirituality, but more important for his knowledge. Because he understood that by disseminating knowledge, by introducing the knowledge of Rasulullah and Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, that itself was sufficient in order to fight oppression and injustices. Why? Because much of the injustices were created by people who were ignorant. That's why when we visit Imam Hussein alayhi salam, in one of these ziyarah, one of these supplications, we say the following. We say that the Imam gave his nafs, he gave his family, he gave his blood, he gave everything that he had, لِيَسْتَنْقِذَ عِبَادَكَ مِنَ الْجَهَالَةِ وَحِيرَةِ الضَّلَالَةِ. So that he may do what? يَسْتَنْقِذ means what? What does the word يَسْتَنْقِذ mean? To save. عِبَادَكَ, your worshippers, your creatures, مِنَ الْجَهَالَةِ. What is jahala? Ignorance. وَحِيرَةِ الضَّلَالَةِ. Why did he give his heart? Why did he give his blood? Why did he give his flesh? In order to save the people from ignorance. And ignorance is what caused the people to do injustices. That's why the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, they had their ways of dealing with oppression. It wasn't only by fighting with the sword. See, some followers of Ahlul Bayt, even during that time, they had it that the Imam was a person who fought against injustice with the sword as well. That's why some people, they turned away from Imam al-Hasan. They said, this man is not even an Imam. Why? Because he did not fight with the sword. Ignorance. They could not understand that the Imams, from their ultimate wisdom, they had their ways of dealing with injustice. They had their ways of dealing with oppression. Not only did they not succumb to the will of the tyrants, They never cooperated with them, and they fought against them with the tools which they had. So Al-Imam Hussein alayhi salam, he had the sword. Al-Imam Zayn al-Abidin, he had spirituality. Al-Imam Al-Baqir alayhi salam, he had knowledge. Al-Imam Al-Sadiq had knowledge. Al-Imam Musa al-Kadhim alayhi salam, he had his loyal secret companions, which he would teach, which he raised, which he worked on. Al-Imam Ali ibn Musa al-Rada alayhi salam, he saw a moment of prosperity when he was assigned as the heir of Al-Ma'mun al-Abbasi. He used his influence in order to win the hearts of the people, in order to fight oppression, and in order to fight injustice. See, brothers and sisters, the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, they embodied these verses. When the Quran says, وَلَا تَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْإِثْمِ وَالْعُدْوَانِ, do not cooperate in the perpetration of sinful acts. This is a verse which is manifested by Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. They were people who stayed away from injustice. They never cooperated with injustice. Imam Ali alayhi salam, he says that if I was offered everything in this universe, in exchange I would have to steal one small tiny grain from the mouth of a small locust, I would not do it. I wouldn't do it, because this is injustice. This is stealing the food, the sustenance which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created for even the smallest of creatures. So the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, they manifested these verses, fighting against oppression. And I repeat this and I say, when it comes to practically speaking, we do not have to, we cannot achieve the level of spirituality of Imam Zayn al-Abidin. We cannot achieve the level of knowledge of Al-Imam Al-Baqir or Al-Imam Al-Sadiq alayhim salam. However, there are other ways for us to fight injustice. There are other ways for us to resist and rebel against oppression. Number one, you start with yourself. Before fighting against the tyrant which is oppressing you, fight the tyrant which is inside you, which tells you every day to do evil. This is the message of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. وَتَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْبِرِّ وَالتَّقْوَى وَلَا تَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْإِثْمِ وَالْعُدْوَانِ. And there are many applications for this verse. One day a man comes to our sixth Imam, Al-Imam Al-Sadiq, and he says, Ya ibn Rasulullah, I am a contractor. I build roads and highways and dams. And the oppressive tyrant of the time, he wants to employ me. He wants me to build roads for him and dams. So what does the Imam tell him? The Imam tells him, do not do it. Refuse it. Refuse the pay. Do not take it. He says that I would hate to see our followers, the Shia, be responsible in any way for injustices. Even if you are building roads for a tyrant, even if you are building a dam, even if you are building a building, whatever it is, you are indirectly participating or cooperating in the perpetration of sinful acts. He continues to say, he says that those who cooperate in the perpetration of sinful acts, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will place them in the hellfire on the day of judgment. And He will go to the rest of the creatures, the people. He will deal with them, and then He will come back, He will take that person out of the fire for the time being, and He will judge him. So it's as if he is in a purgatory, burning off his sins. Many of our ahadith state that when it comes to things like alcohol, a person should not get involved. Not only not consume alcohol, but not purchase it for anyone, not sell it, not transport it, not produce it, not sell the grapes to a person who you know is going to be producing alcohol. See, there has to be no involvement. وَلَا تَعَاوَنُوا. The Quran is not saying do not, it's not only saying do not do evil. وَلَا تَعَاوَنُوا. Ta'awun means what? Cooperation. Do not even cooperate in the perpetration of sinful acts. Get as far away from it as possible. And this is the message of Islam. And one of the most important ways to establish good, it says ta'awanu ala al-birri wa taqwa, cooperate in producing benevolent causes. وَلَا تَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْإِثْمِ وَالْعُدْوَانِ. It's not always material. Sometimes it's moral as well. There's moral benevolence. Moral benevolence is greater than material benevolence. When you lend your ear to a believer, when you protect the reputation of a believer, that is considered moral benevolence. And this is what the Quran teaches us, and this is what the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam manifested. They manifested benevolence. They manifested taqwa, piety. And they fought against oppression till they passed away. And they paid a very hefty price, brothers and sisters. The Imams of Ahlul Bayt, according to themselves, they say that none of us died a natural death. All of them were either killed by the sword, like Imam Hussein, or poisoned. And this is the way that our fifth Imam of the school of Ahlul Bayt, this is the way that he was murdered, through poison. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to identify us with the cause of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to manifest the verses of the Quran. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to fight the injustices and the oppression of ourselves. Brothers and sisters, just a reminder, inshallah, next Wednesday we will be celebrating Eid al-Adha. So the program here begins, inshallah, at 7 a.m. sharp. We will begin the takbirat, so that by 7:30 a.m. sharp we can begin the prayer, because we have to leave, we have to exit the premise by 8 a.m. because it is a work day and we don't want to bother or irritate our neighbors. This is number one. And also, inshallah, we will be having a Eid al-Ghadir on October 27th. We will be having a Eid al-Ghadir carnival. Inshallah, we will be sending out the email and the flyer with more details, inshallah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless all those who are in need of our dua. We ask Him to bless them with good health and prosperity. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات الأحياء منهم والأموات تابع بيننا وبينهم بالخيرات إنك مجيب الدعوات إنك قاضي الحاجات إنك على كل شيء قدير برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين.